what I'm wondering is, do we as Christians believe the Bible? It may sound like a question that should have an obvious answer, but some parts of the Bible are easier to believe than other parts of the Bible. Some parts of the Bible are extremely uncomfortable for me to think about, and definitely uncomfortable for me to stand up in front of a room of people and speak about. Uncomfortable probably to hear about. But a question that we need to ask ourselves as Christians, for those of us who are Christians, is, what do we believe? Do we believe the Bible? What do we base our understanding of the universe on? Is it on the Bible, or is it on what we've been told? Is it what we've been told by other Christians? Is it what we've been told by someone stood up here? Is it what we've been told by our parents? Is it what we've been told by someone on a video on YouTube that we've watched? Do we just go with what society tells us we should believe, or do we just follow whatever feels right to us? Are we the authority? Is someone else the authority, or is the Bible the authority? That's a question that we all have to ask ourselves, and a lot of the things that we're going to cover today are very difficult. And I don't expect for you to walk away from this today with all of the answers to all of your questions. But as a church, we have community groups where we meet every week, and I would encourage you that if you have further questions, things that you don't quite understand or whatever, to use those community groups as a time to ask those questions and discuss things, bounce ideas back and forward, and get into the Bible and see what it really says. For those who are hearing this or watching this online, we have a website, the Trinity Church.co.uk, and it has a contact us section on there. If you have other questions, feel free to contact us, or feel free to come to the church. All of the details for that are on the website, and you're welcome to come and ask me questions or ask the other pastors questions. So, we're currently in the book of 1 Corinthians, and today we're looking at chapter 11. This is a letter written to a church. It's not a letter written to randomers. Paul didn't write this letter and go and flyer it around houses on his local estate. He wrote it to a church. A church is a group of Christians who believe in Jesus. And that's who he's written this to. So as I go through this today, if you're not a Christian, just please keep in mind that this is written to Christians. And so there may be things that you hear that you don't understand, or that you find shocking, or that you just completely reject, that you don't think are true. And that's understandable, because you're not a Christian. I don't have an expectation of you to believe the things that I'm saying. But for those of us who are Christians, what I am preaching is from the Bible. And as I said at the start, we need to ask ourselves, do we believe it? And that's really the main question for today. So let's get into it. Paul finished the previous section of what he was saying with this statement: be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Then he follows up in verse 2 by commending the church of Corinth for basically doing exactly that. He says, "Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you." He's saying, I've got positive things to say about you because you remember me and you maintain the traditions that I have delivered to you. In a general sense, the Corinthian church had been continuing to follow the ways that Paul had taught them, despite his absence. He wasn't there at the church, that's why he's writing a letter to them. And whilst he's been away, in a general sense, they've been following things that he taught them. And so he says, that's good. You've been following these traditions that I have passed down. I often hear Christians speak about traditions in a very negative way. And in some ways, it is understandable. In Mark 7, Jesus rebukes the Pharisees for caring more about the traditions of men than the commands of God. He exposed the fact that the Pharisees had been trying to manipulate people into viewing the Pharisees' personal traditions as though they were institutions from God himself. Though they weren't. They were just traditions from the Pharisees. That's what the Pharisees wanted people to do, and even reject the true institutions of God in the process. We, as Christians, must be careful to constantly assess why we do what we do. Are we just blindly following rules that have been put into place by those who preceded us, by those who we perceive as above us? Or are we holding fast to what God himself has commanded? Do you even know the difference? The traditions of men aren't always necessarily bad, but we can't let them get in the way of us upholding God's commands. Sometimes, though, the traditions of men are God's commands. 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 15 says, "So then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by our spoken word or by our letter." There are traditions instituted by God himself, either by Jesus when he was physically on earth, or by the Holy Spirit speaking to or through his prophets and apostles who wrote the Old and the New Testament. These traditions were then passed on from the apostles and so on to the early church fathers, and then upheld over the centuries by the faithful Christians of each generation. This is why Paul says, "Now I commend you, because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you." Paul was passing on truths from God, which were to be upheld, not mere traditions of men. Sadly, there were some Corinthians who were failing to uphold all that had been shared with them. Today's chapter contains two main traditions which some of the Corinthians needed correcting on. The tradition of head coverings and the tradition of the Lord's Supper. And these two traditions will be the focus of the rest of this sermon. And I believe that sadly, just like the Corinthians, many of us today have gone astray in our practice of, or complete failure to practice, these two traditions. So Paul begins by outlining the basis for the tradition of head coverings. He says, "But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." This is what it says in the ESV version of the Bible. It's the version that I most often use. But what the verse actually says in the Greek is the head of the woman, the man. The words husband and wife don't exist in the Bible, but often man and woman are translated that way based on the context. So what verse 3 actually says is, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman, the man, and the head of Christ, God. Sometimes man and woman can be translated husband and wife without it causing any issues. It sometimes helps to understand what is actually being said. But other times, this can be unhelpful, however, because the translators are putting their own views of how things should be interpreted into the text. We see in the ESV translation, which we use here in general at the Trinity Church, that in this passage, they keep switching between man and husband, and between woman and wife. But there is arguably nothing whatsoever in the text one could point to as a clear indication that these are the correct interpretations of what these words should mean. They're basically choosing to limit the meaning of the text by interpreting something significantly more narrowly than the language itself actually requires. I don't agree with this practice, nor do I agree with their interpretation of this text in relation to those words. So, for the rest of this sermon, when I quote the text, I'll just be saying man or woman to keep things as close to the original language as possible. That might be a lot to take in, but it's significant today because Paul is setting out a hierarchy of headship, and I don't think that what he's saying has much to do with marriage at all. He goes on to reference the creation order of Adam and Eve, and so the principles he's speaking on are even more fundamental than that which would exist within marriage. He's talking about roles and positions intrinsic to who man and woman were created to be. God is the head of Christ. Christ is the head of man. Man is the head of woman. That's the order of things according to the Bible. You either believe the Bible or you don't believe the Bible. Now, does this mean that women have less value and worth than men? Does it mean women aren't as intelligent as men? Does it mean that women are inferior to men? Well, what does the Bible teach about Christ in relation to God the Father? Does Christ have less value or worth than God the Father? Is Christ less intelligent than God the Father? Is Christ inferior to God the Father? Is he? No. Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is the Holy Trinity. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, three co-eternal persons, equal in deity, equal in value, worth, intelligence, etc. But they have different roles and submit to a hierarchy of headship. Both male and female were created in the image of God. But Paul wants the Corinthians to understand that they were created to fulfill different roles in life. He has passed down a tradition to them which is given for men and women to represent their different positions. The tradition of head coverings. Those who are familiar with this tradition may have come to this sermon with the expectation that it's all about women, as though Paul's focus was on women's behavior or modesty or submission or something like that. But that is not the case. Paul's focus is on God, how we worship God, and how we represent God as his ambassadors. This is a message for all Christians, male and female. And Paul actually starts with the men, saying in verse 4, "Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head." This is an unqualified statement about men who pray or prophesy. It doesn't say men in Corinth. It doesn't say men in this current generation. It doesn't say men from this particular socio-economic group or particular ethnicity or men of a certain age. He says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. To determine if this applies to you, the only question that you need to answer is, are you a man? If the answer is yes, then to pray or prophesy with your head covered dishonors your head, according to what Paul is teaching in this chapter. What you do with your physical head, the actual head that is on your shoulders, containing your skull and your brain, etc., represents something to do with Jesus Christ, who is your spiritual authority. He is head over you. And Paul points to a symbolic connection between the two. To dishonor your head as a man by covering it when praying or prophesying not only dishonors your physical head, it dishonors Jesus Christ also. Hence, you shouldn't see men in this pulpit praying, or men at our church prayer meeting praying with hats on or hoods up, according to what Paul is teaching. For to behave in that way would be to act dishonorably. Please forgive me for any time in the past when I have either ignorantly, due to me not understanding these texts, or knowingly set a bad example in this regard. I will endeavor to obey what God teaches in the future. Man is to have his head uncovered when praying or prophesying as a sign that points to him having no earthly head. No one above him on this earth. Christ is the head of man, and Christ alone. Paul then goes on to address the women, saying, "But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head." Woman is to wear a head covering to show that, unlike man, she does have an earthly head. As Paul said, man is the head of woman. This may seem strange. This may seem shocking. This may be absolutely unbelievable to you. And I understand that. It's strange to me. Why would it be dishonorable for a woman to have her head uncovered during prayer and prophecy? What does that even mean? I've done a lot of research, and there are plenty of different opinions out there as to why this would be the case, how this should be applied, who this applies to, what it means. And most of these views have arisen in the past 100 years or less. I've read and heard ideas about how Jew and Gentile women dressed in Corinth back in Paul's time, in relation to how the culture viewed modesty versus sexual promiscuity, or even prostitution, or how people dressed during the worship of certain false idols at the time. I've also read and heard ideas about Paul having an incorrect view of human biology and anatomy based on the teachings of Greek philosophers of his time, and that this contributed to his views on how women should dress. In some ways, you could summarize these various views that I've read and heard as the modern traditions of men. I began studying this topic a couple of years ago, and since then, I've read and heard a lot of different views. Thankfully, though, we have no reason to speculate on why Paul instructed the Corinthians to observe this tradition of head coverings. We don't need to guess or to try to imagine reasons or motives, because he clearly explains it all within the text. He doesn't say women should cover their heads because the current culture sees that as a sign of sexual purity. He doesn't say men should keep their heads uncovered so they don't get too hot when they're praying. He doesn't say women should cover their heads so men won't lust after them due to their luscious locks. He doesn't say men should keep their heads uncovered to show off how shiny their bald heads are. He doesn't say any of those things. Back when Paul was instructing the Corinthians regarding meat sacrificed to idols, he spoke a lot about the culture, people's personal convictions, people's potential misunderstandings of each other's behavior. And he built his case about how we should act based upon those very flexible factors, things which have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, things we have to look at and apply discernment before deciding how to respond to. With head coverings, however, Paul's basis is a list of unchanging truths. And if you doubt what I am saying, ask yourself this as we go through the list. Are any of these realities dependent on the culture of Corinth, Paul's specific time in history, or anybody's personal preferences? So ask yourself those questions. Are any of these realities dependent on, number one, the culture of Corinth, number two, Paul's specific time in history, or number three, anybody's personal preferences? Are any of those things that these realities depend on? Here's the list. These are the three things that Paul bases his argument on. The hierarchy of headship and glory. That's number one, which is based on A, the nature of God, and B, the creation order of humankind. Then number two is human nature itself, and number three is the angels. So number one, the hierarchy of headship and glory, which is based on the nature of God and the creation order of humankind. Number two is human nature itself. And number three is the angels. And we'll obviously get into the details of those. But just be asking yourself the question, are any of those things based on the culture of Corinth, Paul's specific time in history, or anyone's personal preferences? These are the points Paul bases his argument for head coverings on. How sinful would it be to not only reject Paul's words, but then also to put your own words into Paul's mouth? Paul is literally speaking as an inspired apostle of God. So will you obey his words or replace them with the traditions of mere men? I asked that question, and it may seem extreme to ask it about this particular topic, but I want us as a church to ask ourselves the same thing about every single thing we read in the Bible. Are we going to replace the words with the traditions of mere men, or are we going to obey what it says? So Paul explains his argument as follows. Number one, the hierarchy of headship and glory. Ultimately, this is the primary reason for the tradition, as we've already looked at. The tradition is given to us as a way to point to this hierarchy that already exists. God the Father is the head of Christ. Christ is the head of man. Man is the head of woman. He says in verse 7, "For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man." Man was made from the dust of the earth, in the image and likeness of God. Hence, man is the image and glory of God. Woman was also made in the image and likeness of God. However, unlike man, who was made from scratch, from the dust of the earth, woman was instead made from man. Hence, woman is still in the image of God, but is the glory of man. Verse 7 says, "For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man." The tradition of head covering should remind people of how creation took place. Verse 8 and 9 says this, "For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. Do you believe what the Bible teaches or not? The Bible is very clear that woman was not only made from man, but she was made for man. Genesis teaches that woman was created as a suitable helper for man. Those are the words that the Bible uses. She was given to man so that he wouldn't be alone, to be his mate and his companion. If you look around at our world, it doesn't take long to realize how significantly people have rejected these truths. People are so confused about the roles of men and women in our society, or what being male or female even means at all. People are so desperate to prove how independent they can be. They want to be self-made and look after number one. People don't understand who they were created to be. Who they were created to be in relation to one another, and who they were created to be in relation to God. People don't understand who God is, never mind what their relationship to him should be like. Oh, how far we have fallen. Speaking of which, it's important to point out that man's headship over woman pre-existed the fall of humanity. It's God's holy intention for man to be the head of woman. Lest we ever see it as a bad thing, we must recognize God had it be this way prior to the curse of sin and death entering creation. It's a holy hierarchy of headship. As Christians, the way women and men behave and the traditions that we uphold are supposed to reflect something of the relationship that Christ has with God the Father, the relationship that we have with Christ, and the relationship that we have with one another. There are differences in position and role within the persons of the Holy Trinity, despite them being equal in value and worth. There are differences in position and role between man and woman, despite them being equal to each other in value and worth also. Now, these are complex things, and we've covered some of these things in other sermons, which you can obviously go back and listen to. And I'm absolutely sure, as long as God is willing, that we'll cover these things again in future, in sermons and in community group meetings. In many ways, we really are just scratching the surface today. But the point is, Paul has instructed us to uphold the tradition of head coverings as a reminder of the holy hierarchy of headship and glory, which is based on the nature of God and the creation order of humankind. Paul then gives some secondary points to support this practice, just in case there were any doubts within the Corinthian church about whether or not this practice was really necessary. He points to point 2, human nature itself. He says in verse 5, "But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a woman will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it's disgraceful for a woman to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head." Paul here points to the fact that not only should a woman have a head covering on when praying or prophesying, but in a sense, her head should always be covered because she should have a full head of hair. Shaving a woman's head is disgraceful according to the Bible. So is a woman failing to wear a head covering when praying or prophesying dishonorable. And Paul is saying, if a woman is not going to wear a head covering, then she might as well just shave her head. He's kind of saying it like this. Since you're already dishonoring yourself, you're already dishonoring your head by not wearing a head covering, if you don't want anything on your head, if you're against that practice, then you might as well just go all the way and just shave all your hair off. Chop it all off. We've seen Paul speak in this way before. It's nothing new. When he spoke to the Galatians about circumcision, he said an extremely similar thing. He basically said to them, since some of you want to go around telling people that they need to get circumcised, they need to chop skin off the tip of their penis to be accepted by God. If you want to act like chopping a bit of skin off makes you more holy, then I wish you'd just chop the whole thing off. See how serious you really are, if you really want to be that holy. Paul often uses very extreme examples to get his points across. But Paul doesn't actually want them to do these extreme things. He doesn't actually want people to chop parts of their body off. He doesn't actually want these women to shave their heads. He's just pointing out how foolish they're being. If they don't want something on their head, if they're that bothered, then why not just shave all the hair off completely? He says, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it's the same as if her head were shaven. But if a woman will not cover her head, then she should cut all her hair off. But since it's disgraceful for a woman to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. He's basically saying, if you're not going to cover your head, you might as well chop all your hair off. But since we know you're not going to disgrace yourself like that, slap a head covering on and stop being daft. Now, Paul already anticipates a certain amount of pushback on these things, as you would. Hence why he's building such a robust and in-depth argument to prove his points. We don't know exactly what conversations he's had prior to this or what letters have already been sent back and forth, but we know there is prior communication. So, he clearly already has an idea about what some of the hang-ups might be. So, after speaking about the creation order, where he explained that woman was made from and for man, he then says, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. So he's saying, don't think that I'm separating men and women by telling you that you need to practice these things. Both of you are from God anyway. And just as woman once came from man, now every day men are coming from a woman. So don't be thinking that men are more important than women or something like that. He's saying his point was merely to explain about the head coverings. Then he says, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? What's the answer? The answer is no. Even if you know nothing of the culture at the time and what he assumed people would understand, it's obvious from the way that the question is asked that it's a rhetorical question. He's already gone to great lengths to prove that the answer is no. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Obviously, no. It's not proper. But then he doubles down on the nature argument, saying, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. Another rhetorical question is asked here. Does not nature itself teach you? I always hate questions that are phrased like that. Does not this? I never know whether, no, yeah, no, it does. So confusing. But his point is, nature does teach you. However nature teaches this, once again, I've heard many theories on. But his point is, one way or other, nature teaches this. We saw earlier that it's a disgrace for women to shave their heads. Well, adding to the controversy of that statement, we now see the Bible clearly state that it's a disgrace for men to have long hair. By God's grace, our eldership team has always kept very faithful to this particular teaching. But once again, please see that Paul is giving instructions to both men and women. Some men who aren't so follically challenged as our leadership team like to have long hair. But we all must decide whether we're going to live submitted to God's word or whether we're going to choose to disobey. In general, men tend to keep their hair short anyway, and women tend to grow theirs longer. Why do you think this is? It's in our natures. If women shave their hair, they often look more masculine, or people might say they look butch. If men grow their hair, they often look more feminine. You might think that this is prejudice or stereotyping, but the Bible is clear that this is just human nature. A woman's long hair is her glory, and it's given to her as a covering. A woman's head is never supposed to be fully uncovered. And Paul is saying the fact that God has given her long hair to cover her head should be a sign to her and a reminder that she needs to wear a head covering when praying and prophesying. Nature is teaching that. So, point number one was the holy hierarchy of headship and glory, which is based on the nature of God and the creation order of humankind. Point number two was human nature itself. And the last point that I'll mention on head coverings is the angels. After speaking on point number one, Paul added a short yet significant phrase. He says, "For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels." When we talk about doing things to symbolically represent truths about God, one of the questions we should ask is, who are we representing these truths to? And there are a few different layers to this. Number one, we want to please God. And so in some ways, first and foremost, Everything we do is for him. But number two, we also want to be encouragements to each other and spur each other on as Christians. So we do things for the sake of each other, to remind each other of the truths of God. Number three, we are ambassadors to the watching world. People who don't yet know God should be able to look at us and see something of God in and through us. Now, we can't control how they respond to it, whether they like it or not. Our job is just to represent it as accurately as we can. And then point number 4 is that Paul chooses to remind the Corinthians of this often neglected point, that we are surrounded at all times by spiritual beings. There is an invisible reality which exists around us in which angels and demons are at war. Angels are beings created by God to serve him. There are various types. Satan was one such being who rebelled against God thousands and thousands of years ago. Many other angels chose to rebel with him and were cast out of heaven with him. These fallen angels are often referred to as demons. The Bible makes many references to the fact that these beings, angels and demons, are constantly watching us. Angels celebrate when someone turns from the sin and puts the trust in Jesus. Angels long to investigate the graces that God has bestowed upon the human race. Demons watch and criticize, accuse, and seek to tear us down and destroy us. Satan once criticized God's servant Job, a man who lived many thousands of years ago. Satan said the only reason that Job was faithful to God was because of all the good things that God had given to him. Health, wealth, family, etc. So God allowed Satan to strip Job of all of these things so that he would see that Job would remain faithful even if he had nothing left. Job was faithful. And after God had proven his point, he made Job multiple times more blessed than he ever had been to begin with. So we see God allowing things happening in the lives of humans as testimonies to the onlooking spiritual beings to witness. Paul says a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. He doesn't go into loads of details on the point. Is his focus the holy angels? Or is it more about the fallen angels? Or is it both? What significance does the head covering even have to the angels? Why do they care? Many people have, once again, speculated on these points, and I'm sure we could construct many wild and wonderful theories. But what we do know is that the practice of head coverings is to represent the holy hierarchy of headship and glory. And knowing the history of angels and how God has interacted with them in the past, it makes sense that he would want to remind them what submission and authority are supposed to look like. We should all look at the tradition of head coverings as a beautiful and sacred opportunity to represent truths about our God to all who are watching us. The head covering during prayer and prophecy is a unique opportunity for women to symbolically represent Christ's submission to the Father. Only women are granted the privilege of representing this particular truth in this specific way. Men, on the other hand, have the unique responsibility of representing the Father's headship over Christ by making sure to have their heads uncovered during prayer and prophecy. And we should all be grateful that we get to represent God in the unique ways that he has assigned to us. So Paul has made his 3 points to support why this tradition of head coverings must be upheld. Because of the holy hierarchy of headship and glory, which is based on the nature of God and the creation order of humankind. Human nature itself and the angels. Then he ends this section by saying, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. So Paul is saying, look, whoever in Corinth is tempted to disagree with this, don't. Paul and those with him won't stand for it. And not only that, none of the other churches will stand for it either. That's not how the churches of God operate. And we see this consistently throughout church history. According to what we can see from church history, up until the 1900s, basically the entire Christian church worldwide unanimously agreed that during prayer and prophecy, men should have their heads uncovered and women should have their heads covered, in accordance with what the Apostle Paul taught in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. After World War II, we saw the baby boom, which led to a sexual revolution in the West from the 1960s to the 1980s. This revolution, along with the development of the birth control pill and people protesting for the rights of gay people in the Stonewall riots of the 1960s, helped increase the acceptance of acts such as fornication, homosexuality, pornography, nudism, orgies, and even things like abortion, divorce, and so on. Under the intense pressure of the changing times, it's hardly a surprise that we see church leaders and Christian thinkers shifting their views and teachings to fall more closely in line with the modern trends. What church pastor wants to see droves of women departing from their church over something which ultimately we as Christians don't even view as an essential, closed-handed gospel issue? No one's going to hell based on whether or not they cover the head or not. No one's getting into heaven based on whether or not they cover the head or not. So why would church leaders, under this immense pressure of society, be desperate to uphold this truth that they could much more easily just let go of? So leaders relax the stances, and we see women removing their head coverings, rejecting the practice as an archaic and oppressive symbol of the evil patriarchy. And since then, what other changes have we seen in society and in the church? What other truths have preachers been willing to let go of in an attempt to avoid offending the sensibilities of modern congregations? What other truths do Christians throw out to avoid scaring off their tiny group of friends and family who they've just about been brave enough to start trying to preach the gospel to? Oh, how far we have fallen. Paul stood up for the truth in the face of all forms of persecution, including death. He wrote his letter to the Corinthians, telling them about head coverings, knowing that there were people who would want to argue. But he said, no, we're not having it. These are the facts, whether you like them or not. And he vouched for all the first century churches having the same practices of head coverings that he had outlined. Then, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we see the famous church fathers such as Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, Tertullian, Hippolytus of Rome, Victorinus of Petau, all sharing this same tradition of head coverings in their teachings. The 3rd and 4th centuries, we see names like Ambrosiaster, Jerome of Stridon, and Augustine of Hippo. Then, lest you think that this practice was somehow just limited to the 1st millennium AD, the 13th century had St. Thomas Aquinas sharing this same tradition. The 15th and 16th centuries had some of the most famous theologians such as Martin Luther, William Tyndale, John Calvin, John Knox, all sharing this same view of the tradition of head coverings. The 17th century had John Bunyan and Thomas Wall. The 18th century had John Wesley. The 19th century had Charles Spurgeon. Then the 20th century had some who faithfully stuck to the truth of God's word despite the shifting sands of the society around them. Men like A.W. Pink, Martin Lloyd-Jones, and Watchman Nee. These days, it's hard to find any well-known preachers who will stand on what Paul originally said without wavering. R.C. Sproul went to be with the Lord about 5 years ago and was one of the last well-known preachers in the Western church that I know of who hadn't given in to the pressures of popular modern thought on this issue. The biggest name I know of these days who still adheres to this tradition is K.P. Yohanan, the founder of Gospel for Asia. But his church is based in the East, where the impact of many of the aforementioned cultural shifts haven't yet been as significant. All of the Roman Catholic popes from the beginning of their church all the way up to the 1980s, also had this same view of head coverings. And I say all of this to say that when Paul said, none of the churches of God allow for the practice of contentiousness on this issue, we can see the results of what he said. Having an extremely far expanding reach across the world for almost a couple thousand years. But recently, in the past century, when it comes to the practice of head coverings, the traditions of men have instead begun to be embraced over the traditions of God. In terms of how we should respond to all that we've considered in regards to head coverings, and in regards to all that the Bible teaches, I'm reminded of Joshua 24, 14 to 15, where he says, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." This may seem like an extreme message about something that maybe doesn't seem like such a big deal. But head coverings is ultimately not about us. It's not about clothing or fashion. It's not about politics or gender identity. It's not about culture or philosophy. It's not about history or scholarship. It's not about comfort or preference. It's about submission and authority. The question we really need to ask beyond this is, are we choosing as Christians to believe and submit to the Word of God? We should submit to the authority of Jesus Christ by practicing this tradition, and we should allow it to remind us of the love of Jesus Christ, that he submitted to the authority of God the Father. Despite Jesus being true God of true God, he submitted himself to the will of the Father, even to death on the cross, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." Never mind taking a head covering on or off, he laid aside his glory and took on human flesh to die so that we could be saved. This is what head coverings is about. It's about us following in the footsteps of our Savior, as Paul did. What a small token it is that is being asked of us. We should rejoice as we take each and every opportunity to obey God, as the overwhelming privilege that it is. So then, Paul moves on to the second institution which has been given to us, the Lord's Supper. Paul says, "But in the following instructions I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse." With head coverings, he began by commending them, before offering instruction and correction for the few who'd gone off track. With the Lord's Supper, he's unable to do this, as they have gone so far off track that rather than the Lord's Supper being for their betterment, it's now working to their detriment. If we reject God's way of doing things, we must anticipate things not working out well for us. We've already seen in previous chapters how divided the church in Corinth had become. People choosing their favorite leaders to rally around, forming little cliques and rivalries. But Paul goes on to say that he's heard that even when they come together to worship, they're still divided. He says, "For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And I believe it in part, for there must be factions among you, in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized." Paul follows up his point about them being divided by immediately diagnosing one of the causes of these divisions: false Christians. There can be no doubt that one of the most powerful forces to drive churches away from the ways of Yahweh and into the traditions of men is the power of the voices of false Christians. I can't imagine how many churches have compromised on various issues due to the influence of members who ultimately turn out to not even be Christians. Paul is saying division when it comes to those type of people is needed. We want unity within the church. That's part of what the Lord's Supper is all about, is unity within the church, together, joining, taking part in the one bread, in the one cup. However, we can't unify with those who are against us. We can't unify with those who are against the Lord Jesus. If people are rejecting God's ways, we can't allow them to draw us into their ways. We must stand on God's side in all things, and whoever stands with us then are our people, are God's people. So, some division was based on that. Some of the people aren't Christians, and so obviously they're not in agreement. But some people were just treating each other and the Lord's Supper with a complete lack of respect. He says, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one of you goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. The Corinthians were treating the Lord's Supper like an all-you-can-eat buffet with an open bar, stuffing the faces and swilling down as much wine as they could. It was supposed to be part of a meal eaten together where people were unified, sharing the bread and the wine, representing the body and blood of Jesus, which had been given for the forgiveness of our sins. But people were showing no reverence and showing no unity with each other. Some ate so much that there was none left for others who had to go hungry. Others drank so much that they were stumbling around all over the place. When we eat together as a church each week, what attitude do you approach with? Do you fill your plate to the brim without even considering how much will be left for those at the end of the line? Or those who arrive late because they've gone to pick up a guest who wants to come to church for the first time? Do you consider those things, or do you just consider your own belly? Or do you allow your kids to fill up their plates with a bunch of food that they're only going to eat half of and leave a bunch of crusts while others go hungry because there's not enough left to go around? Who is on our mind when we come together as a church? Is it the Lord? Is it each other? Or is it just ourselves and our own biological families? If selfishly is how you approach this meal and this time together, then Paul says by the time you eat that bread and wine, it's no longer the body and blood of Jesus. It's not the Lord's Supper that you eat. You've turned it into something else. Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? If you're so desperate to eat, eat before you come. Eat after you leave. This is a time for sharing and for unity, not for pigging out. If you don't rush to the front of the queue, you might not get your favorite dish. But it's not about you. This is the time to express love for one another, togetherness with one another. And even more than that, it's a time to remember Jesus. Paul explains, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, also, he took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." There's something special about that part of our meal where we break bread and eat it and where we drink the wine. And we highlight this part of the meal and take time to set it apart and focus on it because it has a greater significance than the rest. Jesus is coming back. Jesus is coming back. We don't know when, but until the day that he does, we are to remember what he's done. And part of how we do that is through the bread and the wine. The depth and the exact details of the significance of this tradition have been debated for hundreds of years. Transubstantiation is the Catholic view, in which they believe that the bread and wine literally turn into the physical body and blood of Jesus and cease to be bread and wine. And they also see this as some kind of sacrifice. Consubstantiation, or sacramental union, is the Lutheran view, in which the bread and wine stays bread and wine, but is also somehow mystically united with the literal physical body and blood of Jesus at the same time. The Calvinist view of the bread and wine is that the presence of Christ is there, but not in a literal physical way, but in a very specific type of spiritual way which connects the eater and drinker with Jesus whilst he remains in heaven in his physical form. The Zwinglian view became very popular in more recent years, suggesting more that the bread and wine are just mere emblems. They are just there to remind you of what Jesus did, and there's little more to it than that. These are four of the most popular views about the Lord's Supper. But there are also many other views in between all of these views, or views that share different elements of these views. Now, as we've been studying this as a leadership team, we as a leadership team don't endorse or enforce any one specific view about the Lord's Supper, because the Bible ultimately just doesn't go into enough detail for us to map out exactly what is happening step by step when we break the bread and drink the wine. But what we do believe is that this is a holy tradition passed down by Jesus and the apostles, passed down to the early church fathers, to the next generation and the next generation. And we are to do everything we can to understand it, obey it, and honor it to the best of our abilities. As leaders, we all agree that it seems to be more than just a mere remembrance of what Jesus has done. There definitely seems to be something spiritual going on with the bread and wine. But we want to be very cautious not to allow our imaginations or the traditions of men to lead us somewhere that the Bible doesn't actually direct us to go. We don't want to overstep or add to what God has told us. But Paul does make it clear that this is an extremely deep tradition that we practice. He says, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judged ourselves, truly, we would not be judged. But when we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined so that we may not be condemned along with the world. That sounds to me like there is certainly something with a very tangible power to it going on. I've personally been ill for the past couple of weeks, and I can't help but wonder, could that have been connected to how I have approached the Lord's Supper? Maybe God has been disciplining me to bring me to a place of examining myself more rightly in order to avoid judgment. These are questions that I will have to wrestle with. And I think that we as a church will have to continue to wrestle together as the weeks go on in relation to all of these issues, so that we can draw nearer to God and truly discern what his heart is for us in the practice of the traditions that he has instituted. Paul goes on to say, "So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for judgment. About the other things, I will give directions when I come." So, Paul ends this chapter by clearing up the issue about people getting hungry and not sharing properly. But he says that there are other details that we'll have to discuss more when he actually gets there to see them in person. Some things are just a bit too deep for a text, and I can relate to that. And maybe the same is true for us right now. Some things are just too deep for someone as unskilled as me, someone as unknowledgeable as me, to explain in just one sermon. And so thankfully as a church, we have opportunities to continue these discussions. We'll have time in our community groups to really hash things out as a family and ask our difficult questions. But let's remember though, head coverings is not about clothes or fashion or whatever. And the Lord's Supper is not about food and drink. It's not about getting a scran or getting tipsy and having a laugh. It's about what Jesus has done. The Lord's Supper is about the sacrifice of Jesus' body, beaten, scourged, pierced, crucified. The Lord's Supper is about the shedding of the precious blood of Jesus Christ, which washes away the sins of all of us who have put our trust in him. The Lord's Supper is called communion. We're to commune with God. We're to meet with him as we meet together as a family and remember what he has done. The Lord's Supper is called the Eucharist, which means thanksgiving. When Jesus had given thanks, he broke the bread. Is there anything we should be more thankful for than the fact that Jesus gave himself to save us from the eternal punishment for our sin? head coverings and the Lord's Supper are both things that we, as the Trinity Church, have the privilege of partaking in as representatives of Jesus Christ. In the midst of this wicked generation, we get to stand as Christ's ambassadors. And so we're going to continue our service by taking communion together. This is something that we are taking part in as Christians, as part of the church. And I would advise people who aren't part of the church, who aren't part of God's church, who aren't followers of Jesus, not to take part in this because of what a sacred and precious thing it is. But for all of us, I think there's questions we need to ask ourselves. And there's a book that I read recently called Remember Him by J.W. Alexander. And in this book, he basically suggests some questions that we should ask of ourselves as we approach communion. And maybe today, by the power of God, you have never considered any of these things before, and yet something has told you that actually all of this is true. Despite how controversial it may be, you do believe it, and maybe for the first time ever, you're deciding that you actually do believe in Jesus, and you do want to submit to Jesus and live for Jesus. And maybe you've never believed that before. Or maybe you've believed that for years, but you want to take part in communion in a way that honors God and honors what you believe about Jesus and what he's done for you. Either way, I think you should ask yourself these questions, whichever ones are applicable to you, and consider whether or not you should take communion, and if so, how you should do it, the attitude you should approach it with, and the attitude that ultimately you should have as a part of this church, even outside of communion. As we continue through the service, as we worship, as we spend time together, I would very much suggest that you consider the attitude of reverence, of love, of unity, of togetherness, of gratitude that you should have in response to what Jesus has done. So I'm just going to ask these questions, and then James is going to lead us in communion. But as I ask these questions, please just be considering it for yourself. So we ask ourselves, have I seen myself to be, by nature and by practice, a lost and helpless sinner? Have I seen not only the sinfulness of particular acts and omissions, but that my heart is a seat and fountain of sin, and that in me, as unrenewed, there is no good thing? Has a view of this led me to despair of help from myself, and to see that I must be altogether indebted to Christ for salvation, and to the gracious aid of the Holy Spirit for strength and ability to perform my duty? On what is my hope of acceptance with God founded? On my reformation? On my sorrow for sin? On my prayers? On my tears? On my good works and religious observances? Or on Christ alone as my all in all? Has Christ ever appeared very precious to me? Have I ever felt great freedom in committing my soul to him? If I have done this, has it been not only to be delivered from the punishment due to sin, but also from the power, pollution, dominion, and very existence of sin within me? Do I hate all sin and desire to be delivered from it, without any exception of a favorite lust? Do I pray much to be delivered from sin? Do I strive against it? Do I avoid temptation? Do I, in any measure, obtain the victory over sin? Have I so repented of it that my soul is really set against it? Have I counted the cost of following Christ, or of being truly religious? Am I ready to be detached from empty pleasures, from the indulgence of my lusts, and from a sinful conformity to the world? Can I face ridicule, contempt, and serious opposition? In the view of these things, am I willing to take up the cross and to follow Christ wherever he shall lead me? Is it my solemn purpose, in reliance on his gracious aid, to cleave to him and to his cause and people to the end of my life? Do I love holiness? Do I earnestly desire to be more and more conformed to God and to his holy law, to bear more and more the likeness of my Redeemer? Am I resolved in God's strength to endeavor conscientiously to perform my whole duty to God, to my neighbor, and to myself? Do I conscientiously offer secret prayer daily? Do I ever experience delight in it? Have I a set time and place and order of exercises for performing this duty? Is it my purpose as the head of a household to maintain the worship of God in my family? Do I read a portion of the Holy Scriptures every day? And in a devout manner, do I love the Bible? Do I ever perceive a sweetness in its truths? Do I find them suited to my necessities? And do I at times see a wonderful beauty, excellence, and glory in God's word? Do I take it as the man of my counsel and endeavor to have both heart and life conformed to its demands? Have I given myself away to God solemnly and irrevocably, hoping for acceptance through Christ alone, and taking God in Christ as the covenant God and satisfying portion of my soul? Does the glory of God appear to me the first, greatest, and best of all objects? Have I such a love to mankind as was unknown to me before? Have I a great desire that the souls of men should be saved by being brought to the Redeemer? Do I feel a peculiar love to God's people because they bear their Saviour's image? Am I at peace with every fellow Christian? If not, have I made endeavors to be reconciled? Do I, from the heart, forgive all who have wronged me? Do I desire and endeavor to grow in grace and in the knowledge of Christ my Savior more and more? Am I willing to sit at his feet as a little child and to submit my understanding implicitly to his teaching, imploring his Spirit to guide me into all necessary truth and to save me from all fatal errors, to enable me to receive the truth in the love of it, and to transform me more and more into a likeness of himself? Do I love the Lord Jesus Christ? Do I especially love him as dying for my sins? Do I desire to remember him in this, his dying love, at his table? Am I sufficiently acquainted with the nature and design of this sacrament? Have I carefully considered the history of our Lord's sufferings in the four Gospels? Have I diligently read the accounts of this institution in the New Testament? Am I ready, as a sinner redeemed by his blood, to go to this ordinance? Am I desirous of communion in it with God's people? Am I willing to submit myself to the government and to the discipline of the church? Do I feel it to be important to adorn Christian profession by a holy, exemplary, amiable, and blameless walk? Do I fear to bring reproach on the cause of Christ? Am I afraid of backsliding and of being left to return to a state of carelessness and indifference to religion? Have I any sufficient reason for withholding the profession of my faith? And what is my duty in consideration of the possibility that I may be summoned into eternity before another communion service? Let's consider these things as James leads us in communion now.